Sure, I'm set to go. This is fine.
Okay. Okay, I'll start in 2 seconds, Vox. Welcome to the TMRN Time Monk Radio Network. I'm Jules, and tonight is the 4th of February 2011. Today, Clif of halfpasthuman.com is joining us for a roundtable discussion for webbotforum.com. The web forum administrator is Fox, and today he'll be doing the recording and technical support of the show. Several members of the forum were kind enough to join us for tonight's event. They include WebBot moderators Mulder, Unkbobby, Neo, and members Mam, Sandra, Groundrod, Asetia, and Diane B. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Clif to the WebBot Forum. Hi Clif, how are you going?
I'm doing just fine. How are you guys?
Oh, we're doing very well. Thanks for coming in for accepting our interview. It's really good of you to do so.
Sure, yeah, no problem at all.
Great. Okay, Clif's just released his latest Shape of Things to Come report, issue 9 at halfpasthuman.com. Now, I just want to remind folks listening that this discussion is going to be pretty hardcore. Many of the forum members here have been subscribers to Clif's Alter reports, and many have listened to his interviews since 2006, even back to the Mysteries of the Mind days. So if you don't understand some of the questions asked here, please go to halfpasthuman and buy his reports. Also go to YouTube and look up webbotforum.com for a list of his interviews. Hey Clif, have you got the wife preoccupied, dogs locked up, and coffee ready to go?
I have the coffee. The wife is doing email and catching up on that. The dogs are sleeping, so we're fine.
Okay, great. At least for 2 hours anyway.
There we go.
Okay, first question we had, Clif, was we've just passed the tipping point on November 14th and completed the 63-day release period. We've also just passed the Patrick Gerald 87-day cycle date of January 19th. Could you tell us what you expect to occur in the short term over the next 3 or 4 weeks up to the March equinox?
It has to be addressed at a number of different levels. There's the physical level of the planet and its manifestations that we're seeing at the moment with the trined storms. So basically we have a situation where there's 3 storms that are manifesting now on a global fashion in the northern hemisphere and in Australia, and we're seeing the Terra entity cough up that way, and that will continue over these next few weeks up until March, probably 25th, I think. The issue with the Terra entity is that it's kind of a question of when. At some point, it will occur that the solar influences will create a situation here on Earth where there is no cessation of basically superstorm activity during the lull periods between the peaks of the cycle. And so that needs to be clarified. On January 19th was Patrick Gerald's 88-day cycle. So 44 days in would be expected to be the lull. That would be when we should be having spring, which maybe we won't. I don't know that we'll get a spring melt this year, at least not the way that everybody's expecting. It may be oscillation or something along those lines. But at some point we're going to reach this period where there is no cessation, and we'll just have storm after storm after storm. I think it'll start on the cycle that begins on July 15th. It may, however, start on the next cycle, which would be, I think, April 18th or so. So up through spring here, we've got to keep an eye on the weather and make plans accordingly. Because if we're going to get into one of these cycles, then we may not realistically be able to count on a growing period for the next 2 or 3 or 4 years. At least not one that's natural. We may have to everybody assume that anything that's going to be grown is going to have to be done so artificially. We look at what's going on with the eastern half of the U.S., with the cyclones in Southeast Asia, and with the extreme cold going all the way down and causing shortages in Southwest. And if this kind of situation continues for a while, we're going to have to sort of sit back for a minute and then make plans accordingly, because sufficient resources will have been involved in the climatic crisis that it will affect everything else. However, now we also have the issue on another level. In the short term, it's going to be more building tension in a rising vertical leaps going to little tiny plateaus and then another vertical leap. So sort of stair-step fashion all the way up to March 25th, and then we'll go into release language until October. Not straight down the way we did these last 63 days, but more of a gradual curve kind of a thing with some crocodile teeth of building tension in there. So between now and March, I expect that global revolution is really going to go. And it's going to cause problems everywhere, and then every day there's going to be some new idiot or other minion that decides to add his 2 cents into it, make it that much worse, and it's going to get even stranger as we go forward.
Just to follow up there, Cliff, with this global revolution, and we're starting to see that in Tunisia and Egypt, do you see that escalating to something possibly like a world war?
That's a real issue. World wars are devices of the elite against the masses of the populace. They're designed, they're triggered, they're quasi-controlled, and they have specific ends. They release different kinds of energies. What's going on now does not share a lot of the same energies at the archetype level, but it does share some of the same descriptor sets. So let me be real clear about this. It's as though, how do I want to say it? It's as though the set that describes global rev, the revolution metadata layer, runs across entities at a horizontal situation where a global nuclear war or a third world war would be more of a vertical kind of a data split within the model space. So I truly do not think that the outcome of this will be a war that meets the definition of Third World War. It may well be a war in which, pretty much the whole populace of the planet is involved, but if so, it'll be at this horizontal level against the elite class. So in that sense, truly a planetary class revolution, something maybe new to the species. It sure seems that way.
Okay, great. Thanks, Cliff. We've organized our questions in groups, and so we'll probably start off with the markets entity. First off is myself. Cliff, you stated in Shape 9 that the dollar currency collapse is showing as reaching visibility within the mainstream media by March. What does your latest run say about potential bank runs and bank holidays? And also, what about precious metals and the $5 days and the $20 day?
The $5 and the $20 days are still, they've been long held sets, and they continued to grow throughout this last run in terms of supporting aspect attributes coming in under that. So that'll be where the break occurs. We'll get a $1 day, then we'll get probably another $1 day, another $50 or $1.50, then we'll have a $5 day up in the price of silver, and then we'll have a $20 day up, and then all of a sudden we're looking at breaking new territory beyond $55 an ounce for it, and then it's going to be anybody's guess as to how rapidly it rises thereafter. However, that will be occurring disproportionately in different currencies, because really what will be going on is not a sudden revaluation of silver in everybody's mind. That will come later, but rather what will be occurring will be the initial breakdown of the currency structure. So here we're going to be faced with two waves, okay? On an emotional level, at an archetype level within precious metals, there were two distinct phases. One of the phases is the breakdown at a systemic level of the banking and then the currency relationships to each other at the same time. I didn't see them as being causally connected, but temporally linked. At the same time that global rev and the revolution metadata layer were rising, so is this other systemic breakdown in the derivatives and all things paper. But that really is not the panic to buy point. So that's the panic to buy point would be maybe 2 or 3 or 4 months after we saw this initial rise in the price of silver. And that'll be when the dollar death is pretty much an official or an accepted, at least, general consensus within the U.S. So there's going to be a lag time there. But the entities, the market entity, especially its relationship to the populous U.S. of A., using the global revolution that we've got going now, and we have to stop for a second and say on today there are demonstrations in Algeria and Tunisia and Egypt and Jordan and Yemen and Syria, and I think that was pretty much it in that band of the planet. There's also supporting demonstrations in a lot of different other countries, including some showing up in China. Those are always nasty because they have a tendency to turn into riots there as well. In any event, though, so we're seeing global rev rise. We're going to also see a situation where we're going to get a systemic breakdown between currencies. At some point in there, there's going to be some kind of a interest rate thing triggered or some gold to interest rate thing going, and derivatives are going to start to fail according to how the entity shapes up. And we'll see this $1 and then $1.50 and then $5 day and then a $20 day. And then at that point it starts to break, and there's like a little plateau period that goes on for, like I say, maybe 2 or 3 months, and then we hit a panic to buy, and it's from that point on that the value of silver actually is revalued in everybody's minds. In this initial phase, it'll just be a reflection of the markets as they revalue themselves in the systemic breakdown process. Does that make sense?
It does a little bit. Just a follow-up on that, Cliff. I think in a previous interview you mentioned that the markets might go up, actually, up to 20,000 until it became irrelevant. Do you have any language or information on when the markets actually become irrelevant?
The markets are going to become irrelevant when the value of a big chunk of the Dow, and that's also a meaningless kind of a thing because they shuffle that, but when a major index is worth the value, can be bought for the value of an ounce of gold. So when we get an ounce of gold equaling whatever the Dow is, then we know that the markets are at that point irrelevant. And that also occurred back in the previous depression, which was isolated in the 1930s, at that point to mostly the U.S. or North America. And at that point, we had the Dow being able to be purchased by an ounce of gold, and it just kind of hung around for 25 years thereafter and didn't do much. So in terms of a date, I don't know. It'll depend on how rapidly things start to devolve. Because bear in mind, here's what we're looking at. We're looking at the same conditions that created the Great Depression in the 30s were led by a sudden shift in the price of wheat in late 1929. And we've just now had a concurrence, a repeat of that, with the sudden shift in the price of wheat, which was actually lagging a lot of the other food commodities. As these escalate, the pressures that are going to be put on the whole planet at an individual level will be felt daily, and it'll be expressed emotionally as in a huge form of a withdrawal that will probably take less than 30 days before there's a significant feeling of it. We may even be seeing it now in some areas, but it'll soon go mainstream where everybody is seriously stressed over the price of food. In the U.S., there will be shortages everywhere. Once we get to that stage, we're within 30 days of this major systemic collapse of the back-end paper system that supports the just-in-time delivery system. So you can actually look at the shelves in Walmart, Target, any of these major box stores that deal in food. And as those food commodity shelves are impacted, that will be a direct indicator, very much like the pulse is a direct indicator of the beat of the heart. This will be an indicator of what's going on in the back-end paper side of things. And then one day, poof, there won't be anything on the shelves, and you'll know the whole system has collapsed.
Great, thanks, Cliff. I believe we have a question from Asetia. Asetia, please ask your question. Actually, Asetia might be having problems with her mic. I'll ask it for her. Cliff, in The Shape of Things to Come, Issue 9, you describe a trigger for the explosion of the derivatives bubble as a gold price tide-bound form of derivative that fails in an instant due to a crisis in the gold precious metals market. Does the data give any indication as to what events might initiate that crisis? For example, is it more likely that the crisis arises from a failure in COMEX gold delivery, such that the demand for physical gold overwhelms available supply in vaults, and cash is not accepted by account holders for settlement groups? B, disclosure in the mainstream media of India's purchase of several tons of tungsten-filled bars. C. Rich riots. D. Failure of a gold ETF.
No, the data is actually quite specific. We actually have because the narrowness of that particular subset of the entity, we can drill down to a small set of detail, and it appears that there will be a failure of ability to deliver gold to a select group. The select group thing is a cross tie over to a subset within the powers that be. And it will be this failure of delivery to this select group that will initiate a mini riot among the rich relative to the people that wanted their gold handed to them by some kind of an institution, which I don't think is a bank given the data, but rather some form of a holding company. And these people get really pissed, refuse to accept paper, and that's going to start everything off. And it's just kind of curious that it's going to be maybe these 30 or 40. I have no idea how many people involved, or whether they'll physically show up, or whether they'll be notified by mail that, their gold's now been absconded by a bank to settle some debt or some damn thing. But these people are going to be very upset, and they're high enough up that it acts as kind of like the linchpin to this particular set of derivatives, and then poof, everything just goes. At least according to the data, and given how the WikiLeaks thing came out and this rapidity of the spread of the language planetarily, I have a tendency to think that the speed will also be rather shocking, because there's a lot of the shock word, startling, stunned, speechless, and then, subset supporting that is the speed of the communication of all of this. So once it goes, it should be actually blindingly fast.
And can that be fast now, especially after you sent out that message in regards to the aware observers about a Bank of Sicily in person insider? Have you had more information on that?
I have, but nothing that's necessarily meaningful to the situation. It appears as though I don't know what their role is, because I don't really follow anymore anyway. I used to know all of the banks and who they owned and all of this kind of stuff, but I've let all that slip in the last few years, so I can't really say how this is going to relate to that. There's something in the data that has tendency to make me think that the actual spread, the difference in the planetary distance between the initiatory point and then the failure of the banks. So initially I thought it was like something would occur in New York, in a vault in New York, and that would cause this bank to fail in California. And that being the initial point of the Bank of Sicily relative to the U.S. before becoming BOA. And I thought, well, but now the last time I'd looked at the data, it actually makes me think that perhaps the vault is in London, and there's this like a great circle line that again leads all the way back to California. It'll be moot. It just won't matter where the start is relative to this. That the telephone or the telex or however the information will get there will be so rapid that the bank will hear about the situation at the vault and then literally begin failing within minutes. Now, how long it'll take us to see that failure, I suspect hours, but it might be a day or more.
Okay. Diane, you've got a question for Clif.
Yes, hi Clif, this is Diane B. We live a wee way away from the large northern hemisphere, so I'm quite interested to know if the data shows any mention of the Australian and New Zealand currencies and how that's going to play out in the broad scheme of things.
They're actually going to decay relative to assets, and the Australian currency is going to decay slower than the dollar, faster than New Zealand and faster than Canadian. I'm not looking for, in our data, I suppose I could drill down and look at the detail, but the stuff that simply jumps out, the last real currency that is, I want to say globally, or at least effectively traded globally, looks to be the resource-based currencies in Canada. There's going to be different schemes that will come about after that. There's going to be a Pan-Asian gold-backed thing that'll be proffered, but how soon that'll occur, I don't know. But the Australian currency will hold up a little bit longer than the dollar, but in this way which the data is spread out, I couldn't say if that's going to be days or weeks.
Oh, thank you very much.
Great. Mulder, I think you have a question for Clif.
Yes. Okay. I was wondering, in some of your previous reports, you talked about seeing deflation prior to hyperinflation. Have we already seen the deflation that you mentioned, or is that still yet to come?
We're living through some aspects of it. For instance, we've seen the deflation at a huge level in the housing market. And it depends on where you live as to whether it's personally touched you. But I've got friends of mine that are resident in Las Vegas, for instance, that have seen deflation hit so hard that it's caused the total collapse of the real estate market there, giant increase in the unemployment, even a downturn in the casinos from the local people that would go and visit for food and other reasons and other than gambling, which led to a further downturn and also layoffs in the casino business itself. So we're seeing deflation all over the place. It depends on what part of the planet you're in. For instance, I've got friends of mine that are in the mining business in a couple of places on the planet and have seen deflation hit locally, and it's been a quasi-good thing for them because their ability to sell their products on a global market has gone up. They've been able to buy equipment, for instance, caterpillars and big diggers and stuff, at cheaper prices than they would have been able to last year, but specifically over the last 2 or 3 years, they've seen a 30 and 40% decrease in the price they're paying. So it's kind of a funny situation because it's going to be hyperinflation in food and energy, and real soon thereafter, as the hyperinflation takes over, you'll see deflation hit all over, to the point where you'll see the same kind of gray markets that existed in Russia as it was collapsing out of the Soviet Union. I don't know if you're aware of what happened then, but, professors sitting on the side of the street trying to sell college books, that kind of thing.
Okay. Had another one for you here. Do you see the hyperinflation as... Are we talking about a currency collapse that could actually happen that's not necessarily the same type of thing you would have seen in the Weimar Republic, or would this really lead to an accelerating type of hyperinflation along those lines?
I don't know if it'll play out like it did in Germany, because it won't be a bounded condition. Bear in mind that what happened in Germany in the 1920s was relative to how they had been treated in World War I, but they had healthy economies around them. France and Switzerland and Italy and so on had relatively healthier currencies, and so their condition was bounded right there. You could always actually step over the border and live in a more sane world without the daily increase in hyperinflation, as you can in Africa, as long as you're not dealing in Zimbabwe bucks. What we're going to be facing is not going to be that, because it won't be bounded by any given currency. I think the hyperinflation will, again, take off relative to food and then energy, and thereafter it'll be up to the local environment as to determine whether the hyperinflation spreads. Right at the moment, for instance, the government for years has been tolerating and even profiting from, and to a certain extent promoting, a much higher rate of inflation in the healthcare system than in the general populace. And Bernanke actually thought to use some of the provisions of the Healthcare Act as a method for sucking off some of the hyperinflation that he's been feeding into the system in these quantitative easings and other mechanisms, which they're only reporting a small fraction of what they're doing. And they're doing everything they can to force the money out of the system in various different places where they think it'll be harmless. The problem is there is no place. This is not a set where you can push it off onto France, so to speak. It just isn't going to work that way. So the hyperinflation that we're going to see will express itself, I think, first in food, and then maybe a general currency collapse following the collapse of the just-in-time delivery system, and that will be the undoing of the system itself. Is the reliance on the no warehouse model and everybody living off of fast food and not having any stores and so on. We'll just have to see how smart and how prepared the populace is. I have reason to suspect it won't be even a small fraction of what I'd hoped, because only 2% of the population is in the United States anyway is invested in precious metals.
Okay, so if the dollar actually collapses, do you see replacement currency being issued?
No. You have to understand how currencies work. Currencies are an issue of confidence. If the piece of paper you've got that's tainted red and has a 50 scrawled on it gets 5 other zeros smashed on the back end of it, you won't have any confidence in it, but it may still well be traded the same way Zimbabwe bucks are traded on a daily basis there. Do I suspect that there will be another currency issue that everybody will have faith in because somehow this currency will be debt-free and its grade of paper will be better and its grade of ink will be more pure? No, I don't. Currencies don't work that way. They spent 25 years conditioning the European populace for the introduction of the euro, and even then it didn't go as well as they'd planned. So there's all kinds of issues involved. For instance, people don't consider the gray and the black market. When you issue a new currency, you have to deal with the huge percentage of the populace that in no way wants the government or tax authorities to know what they're doing. So they exist in this gray world where they try and deal in cash, etc. Our government realistically has very little understanding of how extensive that might be. They estimate among themselves in this state alone it's 12%. Some states it's much higher. When you introduce a new currency, you have to take all of that kind of thing into account. So it's not like you can go to a bank on Monday and withdraw a currency out of the ATM that says the Amaro, and you can take it to the Safeway. You're going to have a generalized freak out when that occurs because of all the people that are going to say, well, what about my U.S. dollars that I've got squirreled away in the mattress?
Okay, thanks for that, Clif. I believe we've Asetia, you've got a question for Clif?
In the shape of things to come, number 9, you state that problems will exist at governmental levels for precious metals and owners later in 2011, probably in the fall. This language is cryptic and somewhat unsettling for owners of metals. I was wondering if this suggests a possible attempt at confiscation of precious metals by the powers that were, or targeted attempts to directly and possibly overtly tax owners of precious metals in the wake of the unleashing of prices in 2011. Or does this refer to problems that...
No, that's pretty much it.
Lack of ownership.
It's pretty much an attempt to gather resources for international trade. And unlike the 1930s, that's not an attempt to seize a commodity and generate inflation against a deflationary tide. In this case, the data specifically goes to the idea that safety deposit boxes are rifled, and there's an attempt to tax every transaction involving metals at a level where basically both parties have to accept script from the government. The language suggests that this arises from a specific set of circumstances that are temporally marked by some stuff that will occur in July or August. If that occurs, then we can say, okay, there will be this attempt by the government to do this. There's nothing in the language that says that the attempt by the government will be in any way successful. Bear in mind that conditions that exist in the United States, at least now, are not like they were in the 1930s. The reason the government's attempt to grab precious metals in the 30s worked was because people used metals to back loans, and they had them insured, and they had them registered with banks. So there were paper trails for them. Now you can't use them legally to back loans, and most people don't insure them, so the government can't go to these central sources and then say, hey, go and raid this safety deposit box. It's got, 118 ounces of gold in it. So they're going to have a different issue entirely. I don't know how successful it will be. The bigger emphasis in the language is on the tax out of existence thing. So if you, for instance, wanted to trade in an open fashion and secure a contract or something with the gold, both parties would have to be willing to have the government involved, and basically they're going to take the gold and issue some form of quote, legally binding script on the transaction. And that's as far as the language goes. It may be that what it's reflecting is the government's pronouncement that this is how things are going to work, and it never actually manifests that way, just the way the French government used to make all kinds of pronouncements, none of which were ever followed.
Okay, thank you, Sidi, and thanks, Cliff. What we'll do now is we'll move on to the Terra entity group. I believe, Sandra, you've got a question for Cliff.
Cliff, my question is, do you have any linguistics to indicate the sinking or the rising of non-coastal areas of the U.S. of A?
Yes, sinkholes are very important to pay attention to. We've had language in the Terra entity that suggests both. And that's where things start to break down. We get big chunks of language, for instance, that suggest that rising earthquakes or ground upthrust events will occur, some of which will be inhabited, and some people will be damaged as a result of the upthrust and the damage to their dwellings. However, you might imagine that might be a 9 or 10 foot leap, but it might only be inches, and if your house collapses on you, you're still damaged by it. We also have the other part of it, which I find more personally disturbing, which is the emergence of the sinkholes. Bearing in mind how our planet is structured, sinkholes are an extremely serious thing to take account of, because they represent the discontinuity between the collection of rocks that we consider to be the crust and the core of the planet. And they may, in this case, also be suggesting the flattening of the equatorial bulge, which is what prevents crustal shifts to begin with. And we see both of those for the U.S. The sinkhole issue is, again, on both of those, when you look at the data, you go down through the archetypes, you go down through the primary, secondary, tertiary layers, and you're down to maybe 2,000 or 3,000 words. It's easy to look in those and see how the play of the words, the spread of it, lays out. The problem is, once you drop down below the tertiary layer, you're basically hitting into a detail layer, and you may go from 2,000 or 3,000 words to 200,000 words. A lot of them may be geographic references. So, yes, we have sinkholes and dangers from upthrust events and sinkholes, but beyond that, to say, oh, well, just because St. Louis showed up or Charleston or something, I can't say that those are meaningful, because the geographic references are just so huge upon the internet.
Okay, ma'am, I think you've got a similar question, a related question for Cliff.
Yes, Cliff. During the multiple poles time frame, is there something we can do to reduce or control the pain that you mentioned in the report? Some mental exercise, or wear magnetic devices?
The magnetic devices is not necessarily a bad idea. And had somebody suggest something that's worth trying. Bearing in mind I've never been through it, so I don't know. But just thinking about it, here was an idea. This guy said, and it also makes sense for your devices as well. And the idea was to take a Mylar space blanket and lay it out on a sheet of plastic, just regular old Visqueen, clear plastic like you might get at a big box store, such that you had 2 or 3 inches of plastic all the way around the outside of the edge of the space blanket, and then tape the two together using double stick tape such that the Mylar made pretty good contact to the plastic. And within the plastic, just before you do this, run out some very fine copper line, which you can get at craft stores. It doesn't have to be very big. And the idea is to make a number of copper threads, for instance, that exit the sandwich between the Mylar and the non-conductive Visqueen, and then have these copper threads go down and touch the ground. And the idea would be to get underneath this thing the way that you would get underneath a fire blanket if you were fighting forest fires during the actual event itself. So in terms of mental exercises and stuff, I can't think of anything that's going to help. This is going to be a magnetic event. If you're magnetically sensitive, you will certainly feel this. We have reason to suspect that all humans are magnetically sensitive if they really want to put their minds to it, this is basically how people like dowsers and other sensitive people sensitive to electromagnetism, they're very much likely to feel the effects of this, and may be able to even be used to a certain extent as like canaries to let everybody else know that, oh, hey, things are coming. For instance, there was this famous sailor who sailed in a dugout canoe from South America through the Polynesian islands all the way over to New Zealand and didn't use a compass. Whenever he wanted to find out what direction, the north, south, east, west, and so forth, he'd stand up in his canoe, close his eyes, and slowly rotate himself in a counterclockwise direction until his nose, as he said, told him where north was. And he was unfailingly accurate and was just a fine navigator. And he's not particularly necessarily any different, just a little bit more sensitive. So I think if the language is even a third or a quarter correct, the effect of the wandering south poles will be like being slammed with a magnetic hammer. Will we have time to react? I don't know. I also don't know if the draining away through a grounding approach using the mylar will work, but I don't see that it could hurt. I mean, basically, the idea is to create a quick temporary Faraday cage that you could get under. I know that it certainly would work with your electronic devices, but to a certain extent, can be, those kinds of things can be overwhelmed by the magnitude of what we're looking at. And what we're looking at is killed birds. It's killing sea life. So the prognosis is not necessarily good. I mean, we shouldn't kid ourselves that way.
When you talk about wandering, Cliff, like what speed are we looking at? Are we looking at 20 miles per week, or I mean, what type of speed is it, and what type of manifestation will it impact? How will it impact us?
If okay, well, we most of this is speculation, but it's speculation based on having looked at things like the same effect that occurred on the sun in the recent pole reversal in the year 2000. We had a number, I think 40 south poles appear over the course of a single day. Some of them went walkabout on the order of 1,000 miles an hour. They covered vast distances in that particular terrain. Would the same thing happen here? Probably not, because the same kind of conditions don't exist. However, there are magnetic anomalies of sufficient size on this planet to suggest that as the previous magnetic reversal occurred, there were disturbances that took out areas, so to speak, that were 1,000 miles wide, and went and ran for 150 miles one direction and then an abrupt turn, as though, for instance, you can think of them as like a magnetic waterspout or a magnetic tornado, in being somewhat capricious in how it moved. I actually lived near one of these, and frequently as mariners we're told about magnetic deviation and the effects that you have to worry about in terms of local magnetism. These are frequently not the result of big chunks of iron and stuff that are stored below the surface affecting this, but rather is a regional sort of an effect. So those kind of things on this planet, it's not like the sun. I don't see them moving at 1,000 miles an hour, but it wouldn't surprise me to see them move at 100 miles an hour. It's basically a magnetic field, a torus or a toroid that has broken loose or is being generated at one pole, and it doesn't have a grounding dipole on the other end. We don't have a corresponding north pole for it. So they existed on the sun briefly, and they were quite spectacular. How long they'll last here is anybody's guess. Mainstream science, though, actually does acknowledge that such things could occur. And the one guy that I was reading about, who's Swedish, he's got some good thoughts on it because they have a lot of it embedded in the rock up there, suggests that one of them sort of walked through granite and lava that had been heated and was cooling, and left this little swath that was like a pathway that they ended up even following with power lines, because it was magnetically to their advantage to do so. And it was 150 meters wide, I think I read, and ran for 30 miles. if we just took that as a beginning and an ending point, then we know that at the last time that the magnetism cooled there, we had a 30-mile run 150 meters wide.
Okay, ma'am, I think you've got a follow-up question as well.
Yes, I was wondering, Clif, if we could monitor the additional poles by using a compass to tell if our north was off.
Sure. I suspect there'll be all kinds. I don't think we'll have to worry about it. I suspect as that kind of stuff occurs, there will just be an increasing amount of Sicily effect. In Sicily a while back, there was this peculiar electrical effect where toasters were just going off on their own, and electrical devices would fail, and compasses wouldn't work. Major electrical systems into their area would just cease functioning and then come back on, again, rather capriciously, as though sprites or some nasty devils were doing it all. And it was a magnetic ribbon, if you will, that was just trying to poke out there, and it probably had something to do with magma flows in the area, but its cause is immaterial. I suspect that that's what will occur here. However, again, I don't know if it'll do you any good. If your compass starts just whizzing all around, you'll know it's fairly close, but it's not like we would necessarily even be able to see it and therefore run away from it. This is purely a magnetic effect. I suspect, given what happened on the sun, that we'll see something similar here. We've also seen pole reversals, they think, in the 1920s on Venus, and they reported something similar at the time. And so basically what happens is that our south pole becomes highly unstable in a wobble fashion, and as it wobbles around it sort of breaks up in its amplitude, its strength. And so it would split into 2 and then split into 4, and then the 4 would get a little bit beefier, and they might split into 8 or 16. It wouldn't be that regular. 1 or 2 might drop off, and you may just have 3 at one point, and then 8 the next day, and then 23 the day after that, and then 40 the day after that. Most of them would be reasonably stable to the general region of the South Pole, but then some of them might indeed go walkabout, and at some point the North Pole would disappear. What that effect would have on the compasses is anybody's guess. Would they just spin and zero in on the nearest South Pole? I just don't know. But then shortly thereafter, after the North Pole disappears, one of them, the southern poles, becomes the primary one, and it flips. And that flip can take place in a matter of mere hours on the sun. So I would suspect on something the size of Earth, we're probably talking minutes. And then that gets reestablished as the new magnetic north. And then the South Poles all sort of coagulate a bit over time, and it doesn't take long. We're talking 40 days or so. The speed at which this can occur is relatively shocking to the academics the last time that it happened on the sun. They knew it was going to happen, and they shouldn't have been shocked, but I guess they suspected it took years or something.
Groundrod, I think you've got a follow-up as well.
Yeah, Clif, did you notice today Geo's showing the magnetic spikes southward, and there's quite a coronal hole facing Earth-directed right now.
I know. Not a good sign, again. The activity on the sun, I suspect that the Maurice Cottrell's interpretation of the lid at Palenque, I suspect, is accurate, and that they really were focusing all their efforts on this mega sunspot cycle, and if so, then Gerald's correct, and so on. And again, we'll see a build-up until April. We'll see another peak, which will probably yield some more nasty earthquakes and maybe more superstorms, and then if we're unlucky, we might get northern hemisphere snows in July as that July 15th peak goes off with another set of major storms and more earthquakes. There we go again.
Acedia, I believe you have a question for Clif.
Yes. In the most recent volume of The Shape of Things to Come, you note that the concern for space by a Chinese officialdom is indicated to extend to vast, for them, expenditures of all kinds of resources, and that the fear subset is pointing to what the Chinese officialdom is trying to confirm and what they already know as being causal factors. And I'm wondering if this suggests that the Chinese government, like the powers that were, are very much aware of an impending pole shift caused by exoplanetary forces in our solar system, and if they're devoting sizable resources into prepping and protecting their own minions from this event, like building underground bunkers, hoarding food, Something like out of the movie 2012.
That's a good question. The language could certainly be interpreted that way. I didn't see it that way at the time when I was writing about the resources, because what I was focused on was the resources that were going to be spent at the scientific level to do analysis and so on. So it's as though the data seems to be signaling as though there's a hiring boom going to happen with Chinese scientists as the Chinese government gets real serious in a Manhattan Project style endeavor, or another Three Gorges Dam, only at a scientific level. So that's all I was really looking at that point. But the resources use of the from the Chinese also included all of this stuff about these empty cities that the Chinese have or will have that are going to be purpose-built for some space-oriented endeavor. And I don't think it's going to be like, space ports or that kind of thing. It very well could be that they're going to do a let's try and save as many people as we can. What am I thinking of? Civil defense kind of an effort with giant bunkers and all of that sort of a deal. It certainly would fit with the indicators for China becoming the planet's largest consumer of concrete, to the point where cement factories will open up in other countries nearby just to fill the need. And that'll actually, in a curious sort of a way, benefit North Korea tremendously, because they're going to relocate some or find some gravel or something up north and set up some very large factories to feed this Chinese need for cement that just seems to come out of the data overnight.
Okay, Clif, just following on with the Terra entity, living in Australia, do you have any further info on the Pacific plate cracking and when it might occur? Any hints in the last report, and what type of effects, maybe like a 10 magnitude earthquake or anything like that?
I don't know about the earthquake size. The data that we have suggests that the Pacific plate will crack at basically the same angle relative to the equator that we see the mountains of the western edge of the United States, or western edge of North America and South America line up on. That same kind of an angle appears to connect from South America up through towards the northern part of the Sea of Japan and in towards southern Siberia, and that's along the crack line. So it won't be a separation like we saw in the Banda Aceh earthquake. It won't be that, I think it was 120 meter shift, one left to right, so to speak, a shear kind of a quake. This will be an actual crack. So the effects that we see described in the data show in northern hemisphere, and for America, it shows the west coast rising up as a result. And for Australia, it shows the eastern and northeastern side of Australia rising up relative to the crack in the plate. I don't think it means a corresponding shift downward on the other side of Australia. So it's not like a coin where you're going to lift up one edge and the other edge has to go down. I think the whole data seems to be describing an upthrust event, enough to cause some serious damage in and of itself, but a good thing in the overall scheme of things, because the subsequent water damage is going to be quite severe all around the Pacific Rim, and this is one of those things where the earthquake, or the water quake is described as going around the planet in both directions simultaneously, so not only east to west, but also north to south.
Yeah, I think you're right, Cliff, because I remember last year there was some buoys that apparently they said that it was malfunctioning, but it showed a 300 feet rise in the buoys in 1 week. So I think you're right about rising in the Australian side. I've got another question, though, in regards to your latest report. The question was, in Shape 9, you stated that volcanoes to the north and east of Australia and New Zealand will alter the populations of those countries. You mentioned, as a worst case, keeping in mind linguistics on the side of the extreme, that northern coast of Australia will be the destination of choice for millions of waterborne refugees. Could you elaborate on that, please?
The same kind of, the same data set that holds the information about the Pacific Rim and the crack on the plate itself is built around an archetype of a fulcrum. And apparently a fulcrum is going to shift or change relative to the core of the planet causing the tectonic plate activity, which is going to squeeze out more magma and alter the shape of some volcanoes, likely in the Southeast Asia region from Philippines all the way up through into Vietnam. And it will become untenable to live there, but it will be such that it, in some areas, it'll be a Pompeii-style rush to the sea to survive that day. But in other areas, it's going to be a slightly more accommodating process, in the sense that it might take days to get to the point where you realize, oh, there's just too much gas here and we can't survive anymore. We'd better hop on the boat and head south, which is the only place that has clean air. And that's really what the data suggested, was a diaspora of some considerable size, of like whole damn countries that had to just get out.
Well, okay. What does the webbot say about the current activity in the Gulf of Aden? In your last interview, you insinuated that the powers that were maybe trying to move the magnetic north away from the geographic north. Could you please elaborate on the importance of the Gulf of Aden activity?
It's really goofy, the amount of language that's showing up around that area, as well as its particular, in the grand scheme of things, unimportance. So it's very much like having a lot of words show up about a very specific spot in the Gobi Desert. One would just simply wonder why. So there obviously is a basic a consciousness focus at a number of different levels relative to this very unimportant spot on the planet. And it's obvious that the amount of words that are going on is that we're capturing, especially relative to the archetypes involved, is a small fraction of what's actually being uttered or typed or cabled back and forth. And I actually can't wait for WikiLeaks to come out with a little bit more. Maybe we can find some more trails into this, actually. But it's also obvious that the periodicity involved with the earthquakes, as well as the now noted magnetic disturbances, are not within what we would normally call natural. The periodicity is machine-like in a like a sewing machine needle at a very steady, specific rate that belies the idea that they could in any way be involved with a natural solar current flux. So the position of it would tend to suggest that it's being used as an anchor. Now, I've been given some information that shows distortions in the ionosphere on the other side of Africa in a great circle line that brings it down to the center of Australia, where reputedly there is this southern version of HARP. And it is also in a great circle line from HARP.
Pine Gap, I guess.
Pine Gap, correct. Yes, exactly. Well, I don't know. I actually don't know specifics. It just goes to goes right through the middle of Australia, way into the back, and you just have this nice little line that goes over to the Aden and so on, and then back up to HARP. And it's just real curious that it's this nice little intersection, and the antipodal side of it in Africa shows a upwardly arcing dimple, if you will, in the ionosphere at the same time that this is going on with these spikes, if you will, striking in the Gulf of Aden. The only thing that, there's a number of different points of speculation. I suspect that it's very pertinent to the efforts of the powers that be relative to trying to stabilize our magnetic shifts. And I think that that's really all they're hoping for. I don't know, though. I don't have anybody on the inside trying to feed me any information about this relative to Aden or any of that. But what I do know is that the periodicity of the doming in West Africa is extremely coincident to the peaks in acceleration in the consumption of electricity of HARP. So I think that that's pretty good indication HARP's involved. Again, why? Speculation. Maybe they're just trying to anchor the North Pole and hope for the best. Maybe they're trying to put up a barrier to prevent fracturing of the South Pole, or maybe it's not related at all. It might just be part of this weather wars where people are going a little bit crazy and say, well, okay, let's, put up this dome here so that we can cause these effects.
Mulder, I believe you have a question.
Yes, I wanted to find out if you saw any major activity on the Cascadia Fault anytime soon?
This last time, as of 2010, we ran into a situation where there were going to be so many great quakes that it was really kind of too high of a noise to signal ratio within the data to get into specifics. It's real easy, for instance, to see an earthquake if it's in isolation as the model space has progressed from week to week to week. As you shift these little bits through model space, the little aquarium, if there's going to be an earthquake that's just rising out of the blue and it's going to have a lot of people talking about it, it'll appear as this sort of like a little wave, really. It rises up and then it fades off. Our problem now is that the earthquake levels are getting to be almost as hot and continuous as we find the linguistics around things like religion and politics. So therefore, going into 2010, it was like, well, there's going to be so many damn quakes. You pick one. There's going to be so much damage. It's just going to be hard to separate the damage word to any given population or geographic area. We're faced with that same thing here relative to the U.S. There's a number of indicators for a major earthquake that causes problems to the point where we have to rely on either Mexico or Canada or Cuba, for all I know, some other nation to provide communications and transportation services and stuff because of breakdown of infrastructure here. But the geographic references are so large that it becomes meaningless to take a pick. So in this sense, I don't have anything saying, okay, in 2011 we're going to have a giant earthquake in Cascadia region. But on the other hand, it sure wouldn't surprise me. But if we have one, it won't be the only one that affects the U.S. that year.
Okay, great. And hopefully that earthquake's not the New Madrid. Another quick question.
It may very well be. I mean, we have to stop and say that there's some weird stuff going on, okay? I don't know if people follow the conspiracy threads all the way back, but if you do some of the data analysis. For instance, frequently I'll get stuff in the data and I say, well, this is too bizarre to be true, or it has no basis in a reality. I must have hit somebody's fantasy board, and we have to watch out for that kind of thing too. So I'll go and see if I can't check up on it. And so a number of years back, probably 2003 or so, I ran into this concept of this overarching document. I can't think of what it was called at the moment, but the document listed 3 specific things within it that were on the plate for the US of A. One of them was terrorism, early part of the century. The next thing was big ass storm, going to kick a bunch of people away from their houses. And the third thing was big-ass earthquake along the New Madrid. And now, here we've got a situation where, curiously, the government is hustling its butt out to spend some money which it doesn't have to locate all of these items that you would need if you were expecting a big-ass earthquake along the New Madrid. So we cannot rule that out, and to say hopefully it won't be that, we really actually have to change our language and our thinking and say there's a lot of hints, there's evidence coming out from the government that they certainly expect it, so we should as well. And if I lived in that region, I would be very paranoid because it's not built to deal with earthquakes. Many of the buildings are going to collapse in an instant. The people need to really start examining the infrastructure around them because the government is basically what they say about politicians, that they never build a law, never make a law they don't intend to use, and they never spend money on items they don't intend to use. So if they buy Jeeps ahead of a war, a war is coming. If they buy FEMA survival stuff and that kind of stuff ahead of an earthquake, an earthquake's coming. I would suspect 2011.
Yeah, maybe they've been reading Edgar Casey's maps, because that looks like definitely something that might happen if a New Madrid went off. Just another question, Clif, in regards to final question on the Terra entity. You mentioned in your data, in your reports, you mentioned that numbers are prescient, especially if they come out as words. And you've had a few numbers in the past. Global reduction in oceans of 68%. The ill winds causing 1.289 billion people to disappear, I guess, to die, and 200 million people in the North American populace becoming refugees fleeing north. Were those numbers still in your last run?
It doesn't work that way. The data sets that those numbers appeared in as support are continuing to receive support. So it's not as though we pick up the same numbers each and every time. Rather, items are picked up as a supporting aspect attribute to a particular archetype or descriptor set, and they're put into that set. As long as that set continues to grow and meet certain conditions, it's a pending event. Once it stops growing, we know we're very close to how soon it will manifest. And so the larger ones, though, or larger sets, continue to grow even as they are manifesting, just because they're so damn big. And that's kind of what we have in that situation. So the long answer is basically, yes, those sets are continuing to receive support, and it's a nasty time coming.
Okay, Clif. Thank you. What we might do is we'll just take a quick 3 minute break. We'll fill up our coffee jugs, and we'll catch back up in about 3 minutes.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, welcome back to the WebBot Forum. We've got Clif High. Clif, we'll continue on now with the next set of questions, and we'll probably skip straight to the US population questions. Clif, over all the SHAPE reports and the last dozen interviews, you've always held the belief that the powers that were would not launch a false flag and or world war without first waiting for the currency destruction. Are you still of this opinion, and what does the last data say?
I'm still of this opinion, and the last data suggests that from the 14th, in that 63-day period of release language, something occurred which we have yet to see, which it has a high visibility, but it hasn't come out yet, so I don't know when that will appear. But something occurred that took away a built-up level of emotional energy that the powers that be had. So my opinion is now even more reinforced that their efforts are going to, or their ability to, their energies, their ability to actually achieve their goals has been reduced. That may make them more desperate, but it will make them less successful in the end. I'm really curious myself to see what it was that actually reduced their built-up emotional energy. For instance, the riots in Egypt and stuff are merely a symptom, an expression of this. I don't know if it's like Jay Widener said, the real powers that be have gotten in their spaceships and taken off for their hidey holes in Mars, leaving the local buffoons in charge. But the data would certainly support something even as outlandish as that, simply because of the change in the nature of the powers that be themselves. In support of that, somebody was kind enough to send me an interview that occurred yesterday with Henry Kissinger on PBS, and you listen to his language. And then I've also seen a recent excerpt of a statement by Zbigniew Brzezinski's cadre. I don't know actually who made the statement itself within the White House that suggests that we are indeed looking at a level of ineffectiveness or creep in the powers that be that is to our favor. Again, it may make them more desperate. They may trot out their false flag or threat of a war, but I just don't know anymore whether they even have the wherewithal themselves to do that. I mean, the emotional energy, so to speak, knowing the effect it's going to have in the blowback. It's kind of like, say that let's just make some estimates here. Say that 3% of the entire US of A populace is aware of the concept of Project Bluebeam. And then they actually do use Project Bluebeam. Well, it would be basically laughed out and ratted out and ineffective within days, and would have a blowback on them that would be disproportionate to the amount of energy they put into it, but directly proportionate to the amount of the populace that then became aware of what a scam the whole thing was. So they dare not use Project Bluebeam, and they will be unsurprised if they did use it to find exactly that effect, I think, and therefore they won't use it. So I think we're actually now entering that period of time when events are going to be a little bit too chaotic for the powers that be to even stay in sync, so to speak. again, watch out for the odd little nuke, but it doesn't look like there's going to be a nuclear war kind of a thing let loose. Now, the currency issue is, after that goes, again, they're not in the same position they were even a year ago relative to the built-up emotional energy. They lost something occurred, and they lost the emotional energy that they built up since the early 2000s. It could be that it was the WikiLeaks, and if that's the case, then the next batch, if it comes out such that it's synchronized around March 25th, then that could account for the big push down into release language again. Again, from the 25th of March all the way through to October is not a good time for officialdom at all, and they're going to lose a bunch more emotional energy during that period.
Okay, Sandra, I believe you have a question for Clif.
Yes, I do. Clif, do you have any further information on riots and unrest for the European nations? Specifically, are the riots of 2010 a fulfillment of the linguistics or a precursor of more to come?
They only have brought in about 28 or 29% of the linguistics that we had, so I suspect it's merely Act 1 in a probably 2 or 3 act play.
And I have another question that would go under global. As far as back in the Alta report, you were talking about military possibly being stranded overseas.
We still have that, yes.
Yeah, with the Egyptian situation, could this be part of the linguistics for having soldiers stranded abroad? I'm thinking about the Marines at the embassy as well as the civilians that are having problems getting out of Egypt.
It would seem so, but no. The linguistics that we had relative to the stranded soldiers were specific to a number of conditions relative to the dollar itself. And we haven't seen those conditions yet. And the type of strandings that we have in most or many cases of this, they were not in any way at risk of problems from the local populace. In some areas that was true. But in the main, even those, let me put it this way, in the main, in the linguistics, even those military bases where the inhabitants would not be at risk from the local populace were still distressed because they were not able to get home. So it'd be like now we meet some of the linguistics with the people in Egypt not being able to get out. However, our linguistics would also describe places like Germany where the Germans were not rioting against the local Americans, but nonetheless the local Americans had no money and had to get home. Make sense?
Yes, it does. Clif, if you don't mind, one more question. And this is regarding the tainted meat and the bad foods that have been coming up for years in the linguistics.
Yeah.
What I'm wondering as far as the meat is if this is commercial meat only, or will homegrown organically raised meat also be affected?
It seems to be a distributed. It seems it involves the linguistics that involve the distribution system. So I would think the former and not the latter, because the linguistic sets involve transportation, the storage and distribution, and affect a large segment of the populace. So I wouldn't suspect it would be the organic or the homegrown.
Oh,
you see, the way this stuff works. We might, as I say, it's basically a numbers game. At some point in the linguistics, in each and every one of these linguistic sets, you go, I say down, it's just a choice of a language, but I go down a chain of support, and then I drop into detail that is so vast that picking out any word to be meaningful is really just a real guess, whereas slightly above that, the odds really increase that we're going to be reasonably accurate in picking out significant words. So when we were dealing with the bad foods that have been showing up for a long time, we look for differentiation points that would say, here is something that is key. So we use those as our temporal markers or manifestation clues. And in this case, the key element we found was that the transportation system was going to be involved. Yet another reason to, grow your own.
Well, thank you.
Okay, Clif, I've got a question. Clif, you mentioned at the end of Shape 8, you ended with, what will the shadow government world do? In Shape 7, you mentioned a possible coup d'etat, and in Shape 9, you stated that food riots result in governmental collapse that triggers the hidden civilization to try a planetary takeover. What do you see in 2011 in regards to the hidden civilization?
Okay, now speculation is that they would try a planetary takeover as opposed to an integration or something. The visibility rises to the point where it's no longer even an open secret by the time we reach the end of 2011 that this resource, or the resources have gone for years, decades even, into an increasingly larger portion of our populace that is still relatively small to the populace as a whole, in terms of this being a shadow civilization. I used to think of it as a shadow government. I read the Dolan and Farrell books and have thought about these guys that way, but because it's now pan-national and treats the planet a particular way, we really have to, even though it's very small, we have to think of it as a civilization. And the question is whether or not they realize that they don't have carry value. In other words, they need the rest of the populace. That if we were all disappear overnight, they don't have enough individuals or capabilities to sustain themselves at their current level. They still need us. And in fact, they need us even more as they get ready to attempt to make that, outing or rise in visibility. So I'm hoping it'll be nice and peaceful and interesting. I'm certain it'll be interesting, but I'm hoping it'll be nice and peaceful, and that everybody can sit down and we can chat about things and not have recrimination. But it's bound to be as socially disorienting as anything they're going through in Egypt on a global scale. How are we all going to react to that?
What's the difference, Clif, between the hidden civilization and maybe Jay Wiedner's archons? I'm finding it hard to differentiate the two.
Okay, here's the difference. There's a realistic possibility that beings from Mars, or it doesn't matter where they're really from, but beings who temporarily resided on Mars came back here and set up shop, and they are the ones that set conditions in place that allowed what I'm referring to as the hidden civilization to appear. The hidden civilization, in my definition, are all local boys. They're all terrestrial humans. They're all born here. They're just real smart. They've been shoveled into compartmentalized science projects with reverse engineering who's-he-was-its from outer space, and they got even smarter, and they got a different view of reality, and they got even smarter there. But they're basically local boys. And so Jay Wiedner's description of the archons is a situation where the archons are, even though some of them may be terrestrial in the sense that they might have even been born here, the species as a whole is not terrestrial human and is not terrestrially human oriented in terms of their thinking. So even now, the local civilization, or the hidden civilization guys, when they go on vacation, they think of going to Hawaii and maybe having some coconut pie, right? And they're not particularly, they're still terrestrially bound by their upbringing, their thoughts, and so on. That will change over the course of a couple of generations going out into space, but at the moment we have this rather unique situation. So Jay Wiedner's archons are the other guys that, if he's correct, they've all bolted for home because they know we're so close to the major sun explosion that they want to bury themselves deep into the rocks in Mars. Mars is interesting because it doesn't have the tectonic activity. It doesn't have the crust floating over fluid magma, and underneath that, either if you believe academic science is a giant ball of molten iron, or if you think about it another way, it's a big plasma ball of excited energy. Mars, in that sense, is a dead planet, and it may have Mars quakes, but it's not due to the same kind of situation we have here. So if you had to shelter from solar activity, that would be the place to have your cave. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that may be the case indeed. And from Jay's viewpoint, a lot of craziness that's happened on our planet makes sense if the overarching and overriding controllers have packed up and left the rather stupid minions in charge.
Okay, thanks, Cliff. One last question in the global pop entity. I did watch videos on John Chang and his abilities to start a fire and catch a bullet and put a chopstick through a table. Is the caveman expected to show similar abilities, but on a grander scale?
I don't know about grander because it's all the same. It's just a question of how you choose to demonstrate it. So the very same energies that John Chang is using, in his cosmology, the separation line is between yin and yang, expressed a different way is going to show up with the caveman, but you could use that. He could use that same energy and levitate if he wanted. Levitation is kind of stupid because all you do is float off the ground a little bit. I think driving chopsticks through tables is a lot cooler. Or some of the stuff I've heard about him doing, and if you read the book The Magus of Java, you understand some of the capability of that power. For instance, he can be driving at 120 miles an hour in a car with 3 or 4 passengers, smash that car to smithereens, and yet encapsulate all the passengers in protective yin energy such that any destruction is minimized and they don't have even a scratch. And then, in fact, the deceleration, the rapid deceleration from 120 miles an hour into to wreckage, they're not even really aware of it. They don't feel it because of the yin energy cocoon he can put around them. So that's what the caveman kind of stuff is certainly going to demonstrate. But like I say, it's not unique or anything. It's not different. It's the same stuff that John Chang does, which is cool.
Amazing.
I mean, it's truly amazing stuff.
I can't wait to the nose scenes. We'll move over to the space coach parts now, Cliff. Diane, you have a question for Cliff?
Yeah, I sure do. In my research over the last few years, I've come across 3 separate things which I believe could involve unknown energies from space. The first is one of your favourites, the sun releasing energy as per the 87-odd day cycle. The second one, which is talked about quite a lot, is this larger central sun, which could be sending out gamma rays or other forms of radiation, and that would affect Earth. And the third thing, maybe this is not in something that you believe in, but Planet X is being discussed a lot as well. And I'm wondering if that would be close enough to throw the magnetism of the sun and the Earth and the other planets into disarray. So have you got anything in your data that shows any of these things?
No, and that's the real. We have the. Let me put it another way. The data is so broad it could define, or that any of those 3 could fall in there as well as others. So, for instance, also it could be the photon belt, which is the concept that as you get down to the plane of the ecliptic within the Milky Way, there's so many suns there that the combined effect of all of that light, in essence, changes it from just regular old solar light to something that excites your sun even more. And so our data is broad enough to include all 3 of those, and that's why we went ahead and put it under the unknown energies from space. Now, there are some things that are seeming to point again towards our sun, whether it's, and in fact, actually, we can probably say it's not locally caused because it's occurred in our lifetime. In my lifetime, the sun has gone from yellow to this rather whitish sort of color thing we've got going at the moment. And so it is causing local effects here within our solar system, whatever the cause of the sun's distress or changes, whether it's the mega sunspot cycle or that's merely a symptom of a larger cycle, is unknown at this point and may be moot insofar as we're concerned, because the unknown energies from space could indeed even be contributing to and building up to manifest themselves as our little walkabout magnetic poles. And if that's the case, then certain other speculations have a higher potential for manifesting. None of them are particularly good for humans. And if we're lucky enough, humans will survive, that the race will continue, that kind of a thing. I mean, it's a fairly grim prognosis if we look at the unknown energies from space alone within the Space Goats parts. It's gone from, I want to say, maybe 3 or 4% way back when, which was still a shockingly large amount, to well into double digits at this point.
Wow.
In terms of the total amount of mass within that particular entity. And yet the entity itself, while growing, is not growing at a rate anywhere near that fast.
So that probably means it's still a way away from happening.
It doesn't quite work that way because the entities can suddenly stop receiving support, and in this is what leads to a false positive, so to speak, in our work here. We're going along, we're building up on, we get data on an earthquake, then we do another run and we get more data building up under the same linguistic set for that same earthquake, or so we think, and this actually happened to us. Then we do another third run and we get data that suggests the earthquake's very large and it's going to have these specific conditions. It's going to empty a courthouse. There's going to be a trial involved that involves celebrities and this kind of thing. And along comes a small earthquake, which empties the Peterson trial in the middle of the year. This is like 2003 or something, which it met all of the linguistic requirements, but it was just small in terms of the emotional requirements. It didn't have anywhere near the impact. And the couple of things it didn't have with it were the 300,000 people killed and the nation kicked back to a previous age. So I think, oh, okay, well, we really blew it there. And what actually occurred that year was that shortly before the Peterson quake, all of the support for that data set just stopped. So in the fourth run that year, there was just no data coming in under the earthquake subset there at all. Therefore, when we wrote up the report for that period of time, we said, oh, okay, this is when it's going to happen, because that's usually what happens, is that the data sets stop gaining support and then they manifest shortly thereafter, as though you were watching the reverse of the little seismos for the earthquakes, where as long as it's shaking, you're doing okay, but when it stops shaking, you really have to worry about it. And so we can't say for certain that at this point that data is continuing to come in under that set. Therefore, and also we can't say that it's going to continue to support it, and so at any given time it can stop, and there you go. Makes sense? I mean,
yes, it's great. Thank you.
Okay, Groundrod, I believe you have a question for Clif.
Well, yeah, I'll try here. Clif, in recent revelations you've made about what the data gap represents leaves me wondering at times if it wouldn't be best for us to shut down and disband as a group. It's been tried several times, yet we've developed some powerful friendships and refused to be easily swayed. One of the things I've joked about with our admin is he should never have spent hundreds of hours transcoding every one of your interviews into YouTube videos and posted them on the WebBot forum channel in jest, but goes to the idea that all this is going to do is make the data gap worse. So my question is, does anything about us show up as a positive, one that aids in your work?
Well, I do have that. But let's deal with the other issue first. Yes, I have information that it's positive. I have tendency not to look at that because I don't want to be tainted by some of the subsets there. But let's look at the other issue first. The data gap itself can still be an artifact of the way that we've got this stuff coded. Okay, so bear in mind that when I first set out, I had all these words and I was guessing as to their emotional impact and how long that emotional impact carried forward into the future relative to an event manifesting. So over the course of time, I've refined and retuned the lexicon, but it's not as though every word in the lexicon has been repeatedly revisited and retuned, because the thing has grown itself as I've added more languages and the internet has grown. So I've been facing a dual problem, so to speak, adding more languages and gaining more data at the same time that I was getting further clues as to, oh, I really screwed up on this word. Its impact is actually 3 weeks, and I'd had it out for 3 months. And so therefore I could refine it a little bit better by going back and tuning some of these things. Now, I personally, I think it's a waste of time to listen to me, and it's a waste of time to put any of this crap on YouTube. However, that having been said, obviously that element is fulfilling some purpose within universe, because we live in a highly structured universe, and universe would not come along and throw the idea to do that with the sufficient emotional energy into this particular being if it did not want that done. Now, I'm not talking about predetermination or anything like that, but let me divert for a second and say that I was not the only one that had this idea to do this kind of searching on the internet. I don't know if I even predate everybody that's currently doing it now, because a lot of people are doing it very secretively. I do know that after I'd been doing it for a number of years, I ran across some of the people that were also doing it and was able to do some location analysis on them, and found that there were some Chinese and there were some Russians and there were some guys in Poland that were also doing it. Now there's even the announcements of people taking money from various different venture capitalists and forming corporations to do this kind of analysis. So it certainly was a universal trend that was expressing itself that I just happened to be part of. Make sense at that stage? So the trend's going along. There's Chinese doing this kind of work. The idea was out there floating along. And as I was joking with this other programmer the other day, I was joking with this guy. He called me up and he was saying, I had that idea at the same time. I just never did it. And it was like, well, and we even programmed in close to the same set of programming languages. And he would have approached it slightly differently, but that doesn't matter. But I was joking with him that basically what occurred was that my particular set of vibrations were such that I attracted and built up these skills such that my brain, my neurons, were aligned a particular way, and they acted as an antenna, and this idea settled on it and provided enough emotional impetus for me to go actually out and do it, whereas this other guy didn't get the emotional impetus, even though he had the same idea about the same time. So obviously, or my conclusion is that that's the way universe works. That it decides that certain things should be done. People are acting as certain antennas. They receive the ideas and somehow also obtain the emotional energy to convert the idea to actual accomplishment. Therefore, it just kind of freaks me out that people pay attention to what I say, and it further does so to find that my words are on YouTube. But obviously, universe wants that to occur, and I have to accept that at a certain level, that somehow there's words that are in there that are going to be meaningful in whatever universe wants done. So this is a long way getting back around saying that, yes, the whole structure of the forum is useful, not only in my work. In my work, it's actually very useful, but in a negative sense, because it keeps all you guys concentrated in an area I can easily block out. So, which is a good thing, okay? Because then it means slightly less amounts of filtering.
That's good to know.
Yeah, but also you also have to look at it another way. Universe will put blocks and obstacles in your way to continue or to direct you back to specific paths if you haven't finished with those patterns. So the Buddhists have a saying that when you see the pattern is when you can step out of it. And I think that if you've attempted to disband and it hasn't taken, so to speak, hey, all your patterns aren't worked out yet.
Yeah, we're still working them out on a daily basis, it seems like. And I just want you to know if there's a lot of us here, and if any of us can be of service, please don't hesitate to ask.
Oh, I certainly would. No question about that. And I'd be very grateful for the assistance if I could figure out a way to use it.
And that'll cost you some karma, Clif, by the way. Ma'am, you've got a question follow-up?
Yes. Clif, is there anything that you can elaborate on how we end up being a positive benefit?
Boy, I sure hate to.
Well, you don't have to. I'm not asking you to go against what you think you should do.
Yeah, and see, there's the thing, is that I've got to be real careful. And as more and more people, for whatever reason universe wants, start paying attention to me, then I have to start really being careful that I don't set up any kind of self-fulfilling blockages or any of this sort of thing. So here's the problem, right? You see it in the science fiction shows. You're out there, the science fiction anomaly occurs, you become aware of it, whether it's, a giant black hole that's going to eat you up or something along these lines, or in this case, a time distortion. And all of a sudden, then you start realizing, oh, crud, there's an element of karma involved here, and every time I do X, universe provides Y, which forces me back to have to deal with my Z, which is my original problem again. So, to a certain extent, I really just would like to let it be as to why I think, or as to what evidence I have that there's a positive effect that comes out of it, because I don't want to give even a hint that, it's okay, and I'm not aggrandizing myself or anything like that. I'm just going to use an example here that I know of that speaks to the core issue I've got. There was this guy, his name was Shakyamuni. He became known later on as the Buddha. He got an enlightenment experience one day after he was enlightened, when he was like 66 or 67 years old. He had one of these people that was hanging around as a disciple or wanted to also be enlightened, asked him, well, hey, I noticed you're a vegetarian. Why don't you tell people to also be vegetarian if that's what got you where you're at? And he says, basically, he said, I can't tell them that except to say that it got me where I am at. But how the hell am I to know if it'll get you there? And that's basically the same kind of situation that I'm facing here. I wouldn't want to tell anybody to be a vegetarian because maybe that's not what they need to deal with in their karma right now. And even though I think it may be a good thing, it's only a good thing for me, and I certainly wouldn't want to impose it on anybody else. So I'm very much aware that there is a good component to this, other than the negative of being able to screen it all out. But I just don't want to comment on the nature of it, as squirrely as it sounds.
I understand it.
Okay, Cliff. Just a quick question. You probably forecasted this, but do you have another 30 minutes to go over? We've just got a.
Oh, sure. Yeah. No worries. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Okay. I'm set to go until 10 my time.
10 your time. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So, yeah. Have you got any other time to go over 10, possibly?
Sure. Yeah, we can go a little bit over that, but I'll fade fairly quick. Bear in mind, I'm an old guy. I get up real early, at way too damn dark, 30 in the morning, and go out for my constitution at like 5 a.m. before the sun. So it's a long day.
Fine, no problem. I've got two quick questions. If you can answer them quickly.
Sure.
In shape 6, you mentioned a solar spasm that causes or induces blindness and madness. Do you have any more info on that, as well as the remnants of Ramna, since the alien memes is ramping up?
Yeah, the solar spasm is was still gaining support, and now the very nasty part is we're starting to see official language out of NASA suggesting that they expect that also will occur. Whether it's going to be, we actually had an instance of this in Patagonia, I believe, where a bunch of people in an outlying region were underneath the UV or the ozone hole, and UV light came on in and caused 6,000 sheep and a bunch of shepherds to go blind and kill themselves in the mountains, that kind of thing, simply because they couldn't see where they were going and they fell off the cliffs and had issues. It appears that that's what we're dealing with, and NASA is also now thinking that will be part of this upcoming solar maximum. So in their mind, they're putting it down to about mid-2012. I would suspect that we'll know by Geral's calendar here if it'll be even in late 2011 that such a thing will occur. And basically, I think it'll be part of the pole shift. If the magnetosphere flips, the walkabout poles, sorry about going on about this, but if the walkabout poles occur, and the southern pole splits up, it is at that same time there's a corresponding degradation of the magnetosphere all around the planet, and the upper atmosphere will change, including the ionosphere, which will cause very large rifts. So it may be that sort of thing that we'll be dealing with. In terms of the remnants of Rama, I think that we still have yet to see that. There's all kinds of crud going on in terms of the secret war that's happening. Now, the secret war would actually tend to support Jay Widener's approach that these Aryans, the archons, are hopping in their spaceships and beating the retreat back to Mars, because it's kind of like as that occurs, the locals that they're leaving behind, who are not invited to come along, are taking pot shots at them out of frustration and anger and all the other reasons that you can think. There is some evidence to support that that's going on. And so I suspect relatively shortly, sometime in the chaos of summer, we may well see a bunch of fireballs come on down, and part of it's going to be a spaceship. There's some huge stuff up there, just phenomenal. I was sent a video, which is commonly available off of the Soho, that we actually did a pixel investigation on, and if our math is correct, and we assumed that the thing was at the same distance from the satellite as the sun, then the small middle connection part of this X craft is on the order of 5 miles wide, and each of the 4 arms of the X are 50 miles long.
Wow. Diane, I think you had a question for Clif?
Yes, I did. All I wanted to ask is there anything in the data that discusses people going underground to avoid all this radiation or whatever's coming from
Sure. Yeah. There's huge amounts of data for that, so much so we don't even look at it anymore. There's real problems with that in reality, though. It's at best it is a temporary kind of a situation. Humans have been there before, though. I mean, we find examples in Utah of caves that were inhabited that are 300 feet up off of the floor of the local valleys. Up in my neck of the woods here, we have caves that have human habitation signs that go back 40,000 years. And there are specific periods there that correspond with what we know to be periods of solar disturbances, such as 26,000 years back. We have a period of intense habitation that lasted in these caves, insofar as the guess from the academics, and it has to all be a guess, but it showed people living there for almost 50 years. So that works. People can inhabit caves for 50 years, but they can't go underground for 50 years and subsist underground, in spite of the idea that you may have enough food, and et cetera, et cetera. And it's because of what occurs to humans themselves after they've been underground for a period of time. And we see it with government workers and this kind of thing now, and they're not even 100% underground. They get to, come on out occasionally, that sort of a deal. But for instance, after 47 days, the estrogen cycle shuts down. After 123 days, the testosterone cycle shuts down. So not only is reproduction affected by people going underground, but also the hormonal balance they have is affected, and you end up getting all kinds of medical conditions in a short order. But we do have the language, so people are certainly going to try it.
It's amazing.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Let's stop for a second. You wanted to know about important stuff. It just dawned on me that some of the things I should mention here, especially about the going underground, is that we actually are seeing the signs of the visibility of it show up now through sort of back channel stuff. I happen to have been made aware that some of the celebrities are starting to freak out. I'm sure everybody saw the George Lucas Thinks the World Ends in 2012 article that was out on the internet. Well, as a result of, or not as a result of that, but concurrent with that, I also became aware of apparently a sizable number of, if you want to call them the celebrity community, on the order of perhaps 1 or 2 or 3% of people we may put into that category are actually going to the trouble and expense to get involved with underground survival shelters, either purchasing them or buying rights into them. And this has been rather shocking to some people that are also in like the movie business. So I've happened to find out about it through law enforcement, because some of the law enforcement guys are actually being hired away from their law enforcement jobs by offers of money they can't refuse. And what they find themselves doing is escorting goods primarily into underground bunkers that they didn't know existed in odd places, for instance, like Southern California. So at that level of visibility is starting to break out. When we start seeing it as a routine sort of thing in the mainstream media, then all of a sudden it'll go to a very quick level of visibility and everybody will be discussing it. But at that point, again, it shows up in the data as being almost concurrent with events that would tend to bring about hiding underground. So by the time everybody's discussing it in the mainstream media, it'll probably be the day before we get a big burst of unknown energies from space that fry a bunch of people or something along those lines.
With the caveat that if the internet's still up, I guess.
Correct, yes.
Yep. Okay, we've got a question here from Groundrod in regards to processes. Groundrod?
Yeah.
Yeah, Clif. I in regards to the internet going down and sitting around the campfire thinking about things, I've tried to come up with a question to ask you that would be fun to think about. And since September 2008, I've been convinced asymmetrical language trend analysis is a proof all humans are psychic. Could we do more to specifically to define that? Future viewing, presentiment?
Yeah, well, okay, there's a couple of different things to think about there. I mean, curiously, there's these devices that you can buy now as programmers that are like headsets and allow you to write software that react to brain waves, which is really cool. And I've got one of them. I don't know if I'll ever have the chance to experiment with it, but it's actually if you will, an acknowledgement on the part of the technology industry that it's possible to change material reality with thoughts. Because basically they're saying you put on this little headset and someone writes some code, and if you light up this little electron by thinking this particular way and it causes this particular sensor to fire off, then certain things can occur. And that is not that big of a stretch to then go from the idea of basically a local psychicness. You know, you go and think about green banana pudding, and it gets a particular electrode to fire off on this headset that's sensing your brain patterns, and then you use that to write the word Fred in the software. A rather obtuse way of getting around to it, but it is basically what goes on with humans now. Now, I've often wondered in looking at the language whether it could actually be one of two ways. I describe it as thinking that we're all antennas wandering around, and these waves come rolling through reality, which we all pick up, and we vibrate in sympathy to if we're tuned to pick up that vibration, and then that vibration has to be released by us somehow, and so we just choose, now that the internet is available, to be able to release it in the language so that we invoke the archetypes, and it sort of gets out of our system. So in other words, you're just sitting there and you've got an anticipatory feeling that there's going to be an earthquake, and sure enough, 4 or 5 hours later there is an earthquake. But before the earthquake arrives, because of the psychic pressure, if you will, on your antenna sitting there vibrating at a higher frequency in part of your mind, you have to express it. So you get online, whether it was your habit or not, and you just manifest the pre-knowledge of the earthquake several hours ahead of things by choosing specific language within a regular sort of a conversation that you may have. And in terms of the process, if we happen to be sweeping, we catch that. What would be really cool would be to do it on a real-time basis. And indeed, the government, with the large supercomputers, may be trying that sort of thing. But in remote viewing, I don't know. Remote viewing has a protocol, a discipline to it, sort of like a specific set of things you have to do in order to be able to have it be effective and accurate. Whereas what we're doing here is more like, I don't know if there is an analog, if that makes sense. Remote viewing I've seen, and it's been surprising. There are no secrets. If someone wanted to drill down and look at my code with remote viewing, I'm certain that it could be done if they had the technique and they were talented and so on. And it apparently was so successful that the government invested a lot of money in it and continues to do so to this day. But I don't know that I would call our stuff that. It's more of a goulash, whereas remote viewing would be specific recipe. And the goulash for us is just whatever happens to be lying around. That, I think, actually accounts for a lot of the stuff we get that doesn't pan out, or we're not sure if the data set is stopped and therefore it's going to manifest, because we get these gaps where the data will come on in and it'll stop, and we think, oh, okay, we're within, a certain period of time, depending on how it stops, of manifesting, and then 3 months later, after the stuff should have happened, all of a sudden the data set starts gathering more data and linguistics under it. And in the end, it's actually turned out that those data sets have been well worth paying attention to, but they've been very confusing. Specifically, the one I'm thinking about was the tsunami, because we had the 6-month lead time between the earlier earthquake, which was the one that interrupted the Peterson trial, and then the Sumatran tsunami, which occurred 6 months later. But the data sets were basically the same, but there was a slight gap, and then all of the data really came tumbling in on the tsunami afterwards. Sorry to be rambling off on that. It's always really puzzled me about why the data just suddenly stops and apparently doesn't continue to support, and we think it's going to trigger, and then it picks up again.
Great, thanks. Ma'am, you have a question for Clif?
Yes, Clif. In the report you mentioned knowing self. Is it more important now than ever before to be mentally prepared?
Well, or crazy, to the point where you just don't care. Seriously, there's a lot to be said for that. The mentally prepared stuff, you need to be real flexible about it, because it may also be a situation of if you're affected by any of the magnetism or any of the other weirdness, you'd be going along and you think, well, as an example, I was down in Mexico City. I was doing a job where I had to do some instruction in Power Builder, which is a particular language that allows you to connect front-end stuff to the back-end databases relatively quickly for commercial applications. And I had to do this in Spanish and Spanglish, we called it, to a primarily Mexican audience in La UNAM, this university. And I go down there with this nice guy who has arranged this whole software gig. I meet him the day before. He goes to the hotel, very nice hotel, just ancient, 400 years old, giant brick or huge stone blocks. And this guy is from Texas, and we had an international crew that assembled in Mexico. We all get together, do our consulting gig, and then we would all fly home. This is kind of how that business worked. Anyway, and so I'm sitting there with him for breakfast the day before we're supposed to, or the day that we're actually, that morning we're going to go on over to the university and start teaching. And this is probably 7 or something in the morning. I don't think it was much later than 8. And we're having breakfast in the restaurant at the hotel, and he looks at me and he says, "I think I'm going to faint." And I was kind of looking at him like, hey guy, we're having an earthquake. That's why you feel odd. But it was, and I knew we were in the midst of a very large earthquake. It turned out to be an 8.1. It was horrific in a lot of regards. But what still sticks with me to this day was his interpretation of what was going on. He had no context. He had no frame of reference. And so he felt these waves going through him and saw the room moving and the table moving and stuff, and he totally internalized it and thought that there was something going on. At the time, he told me later on, he said he thought he was going to have a heart attack and or that he was going to vomit and then faint. And he wanted to tell me this somehow as though it was going to make a difference. But it's rather odd. So I would not put that kind of experience out of our potential future, because if you're driving your car and all of a sudden the road seems to be twisting and your hands don't seem to quite work and this kind of thing, it may be that your brain is experiencing a magnetic disturbance, and the thing to do is to recognize this and not ignore it, and therefore get off the road and shut the engine off if you're capable of doing it. Only offering that as an example, but that's the kind of crap that we see in the language. We've had for a number of years this postulate that George Ure came up with that said basically the longer we see something developing, the broader its impact on the population as a whole. And to a certain extent, I think his postulate is correct. And so we have evidence we can cite that makes us think that this is the case. So for a number of years now, we've had this weird image show up in the detail layers of people actually walking across the street in some city and being struck dumb, as the phrase goes, by whatever, whether it's a magnetic anomaly or whatever, to the point where they're just kind of left standing in the middle of the street drooling. The disconcerting component to this is that some of these people won't recover, because the continuing image that has come in since then is of other people coming along later having to help them out of the street so that traffic can be moved, which implies that at least one group is not affected by this. So maybe it's transient, maybe it's localized, as opposed to wide scale. However, the length of time we've seen these images in the data suggests that this will become commonplace enough that a large number of us, perhaps the majority of the population, will have some experience with this. Either they'll be in the situation of driving their car and having some poor fellow standing there stupefied by whatever the hell, or in some way participate with this.
Okay, thank you, Cliff. Dr. Steve, you have a member forum question?
I do. Cliff, since the November tipping point was only your second tipping point, what, if anything, have you learned from it and the 63 days of release language? How does the October 2011 tipping point compare to the two previous ones? Are we still freaking doomed?
Yeah, we're still freaking doomed. I think a lot of the freaking doom, though, will show up before the tipping point. The tipping point in October relative to the one in November is 1/4 to maybe a third in terms of the total emotional impact involved. However, what is different in it from the previous two is that it's a tipping point into building tension language. So we're in building tension language right now. We have been in building tension language, and as a good example for the populace of the U.S., I cite the assassination attempt on the Congress person in Arizona. That was clearly a shift out of the release language that a lot of people can identify with. There was the whaling and all of this kind of stuff that as the actual assassination, but we've had building tension language ever since, especially pouring out of the minions. So it's a curious one. I've learned quite a bit about how the release language was propagated and how it continued to go for the 63 days was a series of seemingly unrelated but temporally linked situations, like the earthquakes and the storm and the flooding in Australia contributed to the release language from that part of the population base on the global pop, but at the same time we had the WikiLeaks thing funding all kinds of release language off of other part of global pop. So in the October situation, we have a sharp turn from another long release period, just as we've had here recently, and then we're into building tension in a tipping point fashion. The October thing, if we had to have an analog, would look like the assassination attempt, only it wouldn't be localized to the U.S. Because this is a global pop tipping point in October. I'm not suggesting assassination, but it may well be that this is October is when they attempt to promulgate the idea that we all need to have a third great war to somehow settle things. And it sort of fizzles. That would make sense. But nonetheless, they're going to have their anxiety fest that we all turn on a dime. But then we go into building tension language, so I don't know what that's like. The tipping point of 9/11, we instantly went into release language, and we were held there by television for a number of hours. This tipping point in November went all the way through to January, and it was propelled by the continuing release language from the various events that were going on weather-wise and then with WikiLeaks. So tipping into building tension is going to be very interesting, to say the least. It would be unlike what we've seen so far. The closest we've got of building tension run was the 2008 financial problem, and prior to that was the launch of the Iraq War.
Wow, okay. We've got probably 2 or 3 more questions, Cliff, before
Sure.
we close. Unk, do you have a question from a forum member?
Yes, Cliff, George had mentioned that he and you had put out some kind of a personal marker to see if the stream of events would continue to the point where the juncture in time would show whether or not that looking into the future is altered. Has that point in time occurred, and what was the outcome?
The point in time has occurred. The outcome is ambiguous. We weren't definite enough in the criteria that we laid out, so we think that it's mutable, and we need to repeat the experiment if possible. It was curious the way that all came about anyway, but it relates to whether or not time is ubiquitous. And apparently this guy Anderson with his Time Institute, or whatever it's called, as well as all of the Hindus, as well as all the Chinese who are out mucking about with time stuff, are able to now definitively state that time stuff in universe is not evenly spread around. So thus we now know the speed of light is not constant, and it changes based on certain conditions. So George and I planned an experiment to see if we could basically come up with an idea as to if it was mutable. Was it mutable by design? Could we kick things a certain way by kind of like derailing time, so to speak? And I believe it's possible, but we don't have enough evidence yet as to what it would take. It's starting to form in my mind, though, the amount of energy is required. However, like I say, it was a successful experiment. We reached that point, and we need to do other ones if time permits, which I just don't know if it will. We're about to hit some really nasty periods. We'll get food prices that are rocketing through the roof, and all kinds of stressors that may account themselves for the data gap if we get to a situation where that's all people can focus on, or one or two concerns. Then indeed this is something that I've speculated with Igor about. The nature of the data gap is such that it really has him freaked out. He's extremely paranoid anyway, and he has good reason to, having worked for some of the nastier bits of the Air Force. But one of the things we speculated was that a reason for the data gap to exist would be a return to the state where we don't have time for anything other than the bare necessities. In early 1900s, there was this early 1800s, there was the beginning of the industrialization impact on the language of the people in Europe as the Industrial Revolution rolled through, and we saw language start shifting relative to the impact on the lives of people. New words and whole new lexicons came into existence as time became much more regulatory. And we lost a certain level of linguistic capability that went to the idea of basically 3 hours a day to survive. A peasant could, with a well-run farm as a serf, was far better off than a industrial worker ever, and is far better off than a cube-farmed person now. If we were to get to the point where all you could do every day was to stand in line the way they used to in Russia for the few goods that were available to be sold, and that you had to devote an increasingly disproportionate number of hours of your day to getting basic sustenance, then that would create conditions in which the data gap itself would be a naturally expected outcome. And I can't dispute the theory on that, although there's a few bits of evidence that suggest that may not be 100% the cause. But nonetheless, that's kind of what we're looking at the moment, is that something along those lines could exist from this. So the nastiness of the food crises and this kind of thing kind of preclude the idea that George and I will be able to do any of these other experiments. Plus, also, we're already reaching into that period of time where we're starting to show some of the holes that eventually will become the gaps. Bear in mind that it's kind of like Swiss cheese growing, and the holes grow over time to form the gap, and it's not as though all of a sudden we just hit a big wall and there's the gap. It creeps in on us.
Okay, Cliff. Well, Cliff, as we end this discussion, I wanted to ask two more final questions before you go. Are you planning on releasing another report in the future?
Yes.
Any time frame possible?
Yep. No, because I haven't. It's very grueling. I've got to take care of some extra report work in the sense that we've got to do some more experiments on propagation. That's how we actually track how far the filter how much we have to filter. And in the last couple of propagation studies haven't worked out very well for us because they've been propagating too far. So, for instance, I used to use Igor would come to me and say, okay, we've got, this filter is bogging down, and this particular part of the database is not being populated the way it should. And so I'd have to go on in and I'd tweak the software. And in order to tweak it effectively, we would do propagation studies. Some of those were done at some forums that we're not using anymore. And we have to find new forums, and in order to do a propagation study off of them, we have to do an analysis. So I'm at least, I want to say 30, 60 days out before even turning the spiders on for anything other than filter tuning. And from then, we could then project as to how far out we might be for another report. And it may be moot by the time we reach April and May. A lot of us just simply may not care anymore.
True. Finally, we wanted to close with a hopeful question for our members. There will be incredible tests over these next few years, and no doubt, lots of doom and gloom. But you mentioned hopeful things in our future. New electrics, calorie-based economy, contribution society, rise of the no-scene teachers. You also talk about monuments being built for the epic times we're going to live through. Please tell us, as a final thought, what the webbots and you believe will happen in the period after this in the 2020 realm.
Well, it's really curious. The new electrics showed up way back when. I mean, they're one of the main evidentiary supports or benefits, rather, for your postulate. The longer we see something, the more impact it's going to have. And even now we're seeing the breakout of the new electrics language, and it's going to just roll over the whole planet and change everything, I think, the same way that it'll probably be on the scale of the cell phone in its impact on the global society, but in terms of how it's spread, but the impact will be of the order of electrification of a nation. So, because America, however, how much we may have desired or tried to be empire, we weren't really anything until we electrified the whole nation. And from that point on, we had such a huge gain over the rest of the planet that even Buckminster Fuller said that if we wanted to change the nature of our species, all we had to do would be to run a single electrical grid around all the coastlines and bring electricity to everybody, and then a entirely new species would be created from that. And I suspect that we could achieve our own transition from the kind of civilization now to a Type 1 civilization just by doing that. So the new electrics, the emotional impact can't be underestimated. It's going to radically alter everything that we've got now. The problem will be the discontinuity for us from the data from now until the early 2020s. But it's very curious. I expected personally that the long-term data, because a lot of it references legal language and other carry values that have long-term impact, I expected a lot of it to be very negative, and it does not appear to be that way. It appears that we have some very big hurdles to overcome, and that at least some portion of the population will be successful, and humanity will be able to start redefining itself. And that redefinition, we're living in those times right now. So that's really cool. It's going to be kind of gnarly over the next few years, but we can adapt and improvise and go on and thrive.
True. Yeah, definitely a rebirth. Thank you very much, Clif. It's been a pleasure. I hope it's been enjoyable for you, as it has been for us. If not, bad luck, mate.
Yeah, it's kind of screwed now. Yeah. No. This has been good. I'm just really beat. I wish I could have thought better. It's been a long day.
No problem. No, definitely. You've been an inspiration to many. There is a famous saying that goes like this: small people talk about other people. Average people talk about current events. Great people talk about ideas. I'd like to add one more saying: wise people inspire ideas. I think many people on the forum and around the world will agree that your legacy is not only the forecasts you make, but the ideas that you've inspired in all of us. Hopefully we can do this again someday before the internet goes away. But for tonight, on behalf of Fox and all the members of the WebBot Forum, we thank you for your time and, more importantly, for listening to Universe. May you, Kathy, Igor, have many pies to come. Namaste.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Cliff.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you,
Cliff.
Cliff.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Good night.
Bye. Thank you.
Pie's out.
Good night, John Boy.
There we go. Yeah, I'm gonna head to bed. It's 2 hours.
All right.
Okay, that's it, guys.